Well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation. I think these sort of discussions are extremely important. The more we explore the issues involved as the class struggle unfolds and US imperialism declines, the more important they become, so that the vanguard of the working class and huge forces internationally, certainly in Latin America, are informed. I just would take it up from what Ben was saying regarding the possibility of setting up this pole of alliance between China and Latin America. There is one condition for that, it seems to me, and the condition is that the Latin American left-wing governments have to survive. And we can see that the United States and its allies are extremely aggressive. Because they're desperate, they're prepared to do anything. And this is where I think seems to me that the relationship, or that certainly some of the lessons that we should draw on from China are extremely important. So let me start by saying China, the Chinese Communist Party during their revolution understood extremely well I want to use the word dialectical relationship between the city and the countryside, in a country that was heavily dominated by the peasantry. At the time of the revolution in 1949, the proportion of the peasantry in the country as a whole was in the region of 85 to 90%. And given the previous history of atrocities, repression, and brutality carried out by the Kuomintang, the Japanese, and others, the proportion of the proletariat, the size of the working class, the proletariat in China was extremely small. So it is extraordinary to be able to establish that relationship where a proletarian party in a country where the proletarian almost doesn't exist is able to lead the peasantry in a socialist direction with the extraordinary results that we are seeing today. And that's extremely important, because unless we are able to establish that relationship between the small working classes in Latin America and the peasantry and the poor, then it's going to be very difficult to sustain revolutions, progressive governments, and all the rest of it. And let me give you one example. If you look at the example of Bolivia, the driving force of Bolivia are essentially the poor from the cities. The informal sector of the economy in Bolivia represents 65% of the whole economy, of the economically active population, 65%. And most of them are displaced peasants that actually were forced to leave the countryside in order to find some form of employment, which they found in the city by selling stuff in the street. I've seen them myself with my own eyes, particularly in La Paz, in El Alto. So what is the driving force of the socialist revolution in Bolivia? Well, the mass has been able to actually organize this huge mass of population, organizing in all sorts of committees, organizations, grassroots bodies, and so on. There's been a huge amount of spontaneity there, and they're leading them in a socialist direction. So this means that the only possibility actually to get somewhere in terms of changing the nature of the state, the nature of society, and the nature of the economy is by establishing that relationship. And this goes back to the teachings of José Carlos Mariátegui in the 1920s. I'm not going to go into that discussion because it would take too long, but this brings me also to the key discussions that were taking place during the Soviet economic debates in the 1920s, which were exactly or very similar to this. I remember having a meeting with the Nicaraguan ambassador, one Nicaraguan ambassador, and I remember saying to him how Nicaragua has been able to organize their society in such a way. For example, in Nicaragua, something like 60 to 65% of the economically active population are also in the informal sector. And the proportion of the working class in Nicaragua is extremely small. Nevertheless, the FSLN has been able to organize them so successfully that, they have been able to not only come back to office in 2006, where in Venezuela, if you were to look at the state that was there in 1998 when Hugo Chavez was elected, that state is extremely different from the state that exists today. And unless you're able to reform, transform, modify these key state institutions, not just transform the economy, which is also important, but unless we're able to do that, we're not going to be able to get too far. Two examples that come to mind. The Brazilians were not very keen in mobilizing their grassroots, their key popular support, from 2002 all the way to 2016, 2014, 16, when the coup d'etat against Dilma Rousseff took place. I think they realized with hindsight, as we all do, that actually that was a mistake. Whereas in Venezuela, in order for them to defend themselves against aggression from the United States and their allies, they set up the popular militias, which is 3 million, members of the population armed. So that is extremely important to understand that. Unless we're able to understand that, we will not be able to sustain a long-term relationship, economic relationship, political relationship, or any other kind of relationship with China. Because if the right wing takes, and Bolivia is an example where we thought that was completely unassailable, and in 2019 they were able to overthrow the mass government. And the Bolivian masses went through a period of hell for 1 year. They were able to recover, and I'll come back to this point later on. Now, there was a commodity boom. Latin America was selling a huge amount of commodities to China all the way to 2009, 2010, with the credit crunch hit the economy very heavily. And at the time, or around that time, the Economic Commission for Latin America produced a report, which it sort of brought out an important dimension to this relationship. The ICLAC report said, it's excellent that this relationship, which is becoming significantly strategic between Latin America and China, continues and deepens, but unless the commodities boom transforms itself into technological transfer, and where the Latin Americans are able to use these extra resources to transform technologically their economy, then, as soon as there is any disturbance in the world economy, this might stop. And this is exactly what happened. In terms of the relationship between China and the United States, China now is a source for Latin America of credit, investment, markets, and technology. We all know that there are at least 3 satellites that have been sent to space with Chinese technology. There is no question about this. So the relationship between China and Latin America must be based on this win-win relationship. Let me give you an example of the potential that China has for Latin America. This comes from tourism, which is a thriving industry, certainly Latin America. In 2019, 130 million Chinese tourists went out to the world, 130 million. And in that year, in 2019, they spent $277 billion, which was nearly double what the US tourists actually spent on that year. So imagine if any country were to able to capture 1%, only 1% of that total, of Chinese tourists. It's extraordinary. Let me give you one example of where this potential, the potential that this has. Mexico receives 41 million tourists every year. About 35 million of them come from the United States. And in the year 2019, these are figures from that year. In the year 2019, Mexico received only 75,000 Chinese tourists. And the potential of Mexico, which is already very keenly and very busily trying to rectify this relationship with China, is enormous. So the crucial question for us in terms of mobilizing the population against US aggression is the defense of national sovereignty. And there is one example where Latin America shows that it is possible to defend the national sovereignty where, compared to countries which are much more powerful, such as the European ones that don't do it at all. And the declining empire of the United States is forcing the Europeans to accept things which actually will lead to a substantial decline of the standard of living of their population. Just think about it. By the United States forcing the European Union to not accept cheap Russian gas, and they will have to look for alternatives elsewhere. And this is likely to be from the United States and Canada, with only the transport costs will mean that the cost of the gas, which not only goes into heating houses, but it goes into all sorts of industrial processes and many other areas of economic activity, is going to definitely make the situation of the European Union extremely bad. And on top of that, the United States is pushing the European Union, and certainly many of the Europeans have accepted this, is to increase their military expenditure dramatically. Germany has already announced it. So what this relationship means is this, that by Europe not defending, and I know this is a difficult concept, not defending their national sovereignty, what they're doing is they're forcing a declining, which could be very severe, of the living standard of their population. So this is where Latin America is able to do this, and this is a relationship that Latin America has to have with China. There is no question about it that we have been able to fight back. One of the advantages that we enjoy in terms of our fighting back is the fact that the application of neoliberal policies undermine quite dramatically the potential for consolidation of right-wing governments. We've seen this with Macri. We certainly have seen this with Bolsonaro in Brazil. We even saw that with Gianni Áñez in Bolivia and so on. And certainly we're going to see very likely, and we hope so, a victory in Bolivia. So the only way to establish a new geopolitics in terms of Latin America-China relationship is by multipolarity, which means that unless Latin America benefits massively out of it, so that the progressive governments can consolidate and expand their influence in the region and begin a process of regional integration, this might be set back. Even if the setting back may be brief, still is problematic and it's important, especially now that the United States is so desperate and is prepared to go even to war, as we've seen in Ukraine. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.